The courtroom was silent as Karoline Leavitt stood before the judge, a small silver cross hanging around her neck. Moments ago, she had been fined for wearing it, a ruling that seemed final, but instead of backing down, she smiled. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that fine is unconstitutional." The judge raised an eyebrow. The audience leaned in. No one expected what happened next. As Karoline calmly laid out her case, citing laws and Supreme Court rulings, the judge's expression shifted from stern to stunned. Who was this woman? And how did she know the law better than the lawyers in the room? Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new one. Karoline Leavitt stood in the courtroom, her hands calmly resting on the wooden table in front of her. She had never expected to be here, facing a fine simply for wearing a small silver cross around her neck. Judge Richard Morrison peered at her over his glasses, his expression firm. "Ms. Leavitt, religious symbols are not permitted in this courtroom. You are hereby fined $500 for violating the dress code." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Karoline, however, did not flinch. Instead, she slowly smiled. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and confident, "I respectfully challenge your ruling." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And on what grounds?" She took a deep breath and began. "According to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, I have the right to freely express my religion. Furthermore, in Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, the Supreme Court ruled that symbolic expression is protected under the First Amendment, unless it causes a disruption. My cross, Your Honor, has caused no such disruption." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Are you an attorney, Ms. Leavitt?" he asked. Karoline shook her head. "No, Your Honor, just someone who knows the law." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Go on." The judge's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Ms. Leavitt, you're arguing constitutional law in my courtroom. Do you really think you can outmaneuver me?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, it's not about outmaneuvering you. It's about upholding the law. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that government officials cannot impose restrictions on religious expression unless there's a compelling state interest. Are you saying my small cross is a threat to the court's ability to function?" A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stiffly by the judge's side, shifted slightly as if reconsidering the situation. Judge Morrison let out a slow breath. "Ms. Leavitt, you are not a lawyer, yet you seem to be quoting legal precedents with remarkable accuracy. Tell me, how do you know all this?" Karoline smiled. "I've studied constitutional law extensively, Your Honor. I may not have a law degree, but I know my rights." The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, thinking. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward. "Tell me, Ms. Leavitt, if I were to uphold this fine, what would your next move be?" Without missing a beat, Karoline replied, "I would appeal, Your Honor, and I'd win." A few gasps echoed through the room. The judge's lips curled into a smirk, as if he had just stumbled upon something unexpected. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Morrison studied Karoline, his fingers still drumming lightly against the bench. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and let out a short chuckle. "Well, Ms. Leavitt," he said, "I have to admit, you've got guts and intelligence." He flipped through some papers in front of him, but it was clear his mind was elsewhere. "Tell me, if you were arguing this case in front of an appellate court, how would you present it?" Karoline didn't miss a beat. "First, I'd establish that this fine violates the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Then I'd cite West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. where the Supreme Court ruled that no government official has the authority to dictate what is acceptable religious expression. I'd follow that with Employment Division versus Smith, which set the standard that a law restricting religious freedom must serve a compelling government interest and be applied neutrally. Since this so-called dress code isn't being applied evenly because I see people in this courtroom wearing jewelry and other personal items, it fails the neutrality test. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing for a moment, staring at Karoline in awe. Judge Morrison exhaled and shook his head. "Ms. Leavitt, I should have charged you with practicing law without a license," he said dryly. A few people chuckled, but Karoline remained serious. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not practicing law. I'm defending myself." Judge Morrison let out a long sigh. He tapped his gavel once, then leaned forward. "Ms. Leavitt, I've decided to rescind your fine. You've made your case well." The room filled with whispers. Karoline felt a wave of relief, but remained composed. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "One more thing," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Have you ever considered going to law school?" Karoline smiled. "I have, and after today I think I just might." The judge smirked. "Good, because the legal world could use someone like you." With that, he banged his gavel, and court was adjourned. Since the judge had dismissed the fine, Karoline gathered her things and prepared to leave. But before she could step out of the courtroom, a well-dressed man in a navy blue suit approached her. "Excuse me, Ms. Leavitt," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm a senior partner at Whitaker & Reed, a law firm specializing in constitutional law." Karoline shook his hand, a bit surprised. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Whitaker. How can I help you?" Whitaker chuckled. "The real question is, how can we help you? You just argued your case better than most first-year law students. Have you seriously never studied law formally?" Karoline shrugged. "Just a lot of independent study. It's always been a passion of mine." Whitaker nodded, impressed. "Well, I'd like to offer you something rare, a mentorship at our firm. You wouldn't need a law degree to start. We could train you, give you real-world experience, and even sponsor you if you decide to attend law school." Karoline's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He handed her a business card. "Think about it. Someone like you shouldn't let this talent go to waste." Karoline glanced at the card, her heart racing. She had come into court expecting a fine. Now she was walking out with an opportunity of a lifetime. As she stepped outside, she looked up at the sky and smiled. Maybe this was meant to happen after all, she whispered to herself. And with that, she walked away, toward a future she never saw coming. Karoline held the business card tightly in her hand as she walked down the courthouse steps. The world felt different, brighter, full of possibilities. She had always believed in standing up for what was right, but she never imagined it would lead to an actual career opportunity. Later that evening, she sat at her small apartment's kitchen table, staring at the card, Whitaker & Reed, one of the most respected constitutional law firms in the country. She had read about their cases, fighting for free speech, religious freedom, and individual rights. It was exactly the kind of work she admired. Her phone buzzed. It was her best friend, Mia. "Mia, saw what happened in court today. You're all over the news." Karoline frowned and quickly opened her laptop. Sure enough, multiple articles had already popped up. "Woman fined for wearing a cross stuns judge with legal knowledge." Karoline Leavitt challenges court ruling and wins. There was even a short clip circulating from inside the courtroom. She watched herself calmly present her argument, the judge's reaction, and the final moment when he dropped the fine. Mia texted again. Mia. You're famous. What's next? Karoline took a deep breath. She didn't know the full answer yet, but she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The next morning, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the business card. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Daniel Whitaker speaking. Karoline smiled. Mr. Whitaker, this is Karoline Leavitt. I've thought about your offer. A slight pause, then a chuckle. And? I'm in. Whitaker's voice was filled with satisfaction. Good choice, Ms. Leavitt. Welcome to the legal world. As she hung up, Karoline felt a surge of excitement. She had just stepped onto a path she never expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the path she was always meant to walk. A week later, Karoline found herself standing in front of a towering glass building in downtown Boston, the headquarters of Whitaker and Reed. The firm's name was etched in gold letters above the entrance, and as she stepped inside, she couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. The receptionist greeted her with a warm smile. Ms. Leavitt, Mr. Whitaker is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 15th floor. Karoline thanked her and stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. This is real, she thought. I'm actually doing this. When the doors opened, she was met by Daniel Whitaker himself. Dressed in another sharp suit, he extended his hand. Welcome, Karoline. I'm glad you decided to join us. They walked through the office, past rows of attorneys discussing cases, stacks of legal books, and the constant hum of activity. Finally, they entered a sleek conference room where a few other attorneys sat waiting. Whitaker gestured for her to sit. Before we get into the details of your mentorship, I wanted you to meet some of our team. They've seen your courtroom clip and are very impressed. A woman with sharp eyes and a confident presence leaned forward. Karoline, I'm Julia Myers, senior litigator. I have to ask, how did you teach yourself constitutional law so well? Karoline smiled, feeling more at ease. Lots of reading, research, and debates. I've always believed that understanding the law is the best way to protect yourself and others. Julia nodded approvingly. You've got raw talent. We're going to sharpen it. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. We want to start you as a legal researcher. You'll work with our attorneys, assist on real cases, and if you're interested, we'll support you through law school. Karoline's heart raced. This was bigger than she imagined. I'd love that, she said. Whitaker grinned. Good. Then let's get to work. As Karoline picked up her first case file, she knew this was just the beginning of an incredible journey. Karolina dove into her new role with everything she had. For the first few weeks, she spent most of her time buried in legal documents, case files, and constitutional law texts. Every day was a challenge, but she loved it. She wasn't just studying the law, she was seeing it in action. One evening, as she was finishing up some research, Julia Myers stopped by her desk. Karoline, she said, we're bringing you into a client meeting tomorrow. I want you to observe how we build a case. Karoline straightened in her chair. Really? I thought I'd be stuck with research for a while. Julia smirked. Normally, yes, but you're learning fast. And besides, this case is right up your alley. It's about a woman who was fired for wearing a cross at work. Karoline's eyes widened. That's ironic. More like fate, Julia said. Be ready at 9 a.m. The next morning, Karoline sat in the firm's sleek conference room as their client, a middle-aged woman named Lisa Carter, tearfully explained her story. I've worn this cross for years, Lisa said, clutching the small pendant around her neck. But last month, my new manager said it violated company policy. When I refused to take it off, they fired me. Karoline clenched her jaw. This is exactly why I wanted to study the law. Whitaker leaned forward. Lisa, your case falls under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Employers must provide reasonable accommodations for religious expression unless it causes an undue hardship. Lisa nodded, but still looked uncertain. Do you really think we have a case? Before Whitaker could answer, Karoline spoke up. Not only do you have a case, Lisa, you have a strong one. The room went silent. Julia and Whitaker exchanged glances but said nothing, letting Karoline continue. Your employer would have to prove that allowing you to wear a cross caused significant harm to their business. Since other employees likely wear jewelry or symbols without issue, their argument won't hold up. Plus, there's precedent, EEOCV. Abercrombie & Fitch, where a company was found guilty of religious discrimination for refusing to hire a woman who wore a headscarf. Lisa's face lit up with hope. So I can fight this? Karoline nodded firmly. And we'll fight it with you? Whitaker leaned back in his chair, an impressed smile forming. Looks like we found our newest legal mind. Karoline felt a surge of confidence. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was her calling. Over the next few weeks, Karoline worked side by side with Whitaker and Julia, helping build Lisa's case. She pored over legal precedents, drafted arguments, and even sat in on strategy meetings. Every day she felt more certain this was where she was meant to be. When the trial finally came, Karoline sat in the courtroom, watching as Whitaker presented their case. Lisa sat beside her, gripping her cross tightly, hope shining in her eyes. As the judge listened to their arguments, Karoline felt a familiar sense of déjà vu. Just weeks ago she had stood in a courtroom defending herself. Now she was helping defend someone else. And when the judge ruled in Lisa's favor, Karoline knew this was just the beginning of a long, meaningful career. She smiled to herself. I may not have planned this path, but I was always meant to walk it.